Welcome back, you all. Today we are going to be talking about the Gilded Age. So before we jump in, it's probably a good idea to define what we mean by Gilded Age. So Gilded Age is a term popularized by Mark Twain in the late 19th century in his writings, where he refers to something that is gold on the outside, but it looks gold. So it's something that looks very valuable or prosperous, right? But when you really get to the bottom of it, that it's something that's made of wood with a thin veneer of gold on the outside. So it looks like it's solid gold and it's awesome, but on the inside you see that it's actually something that is decomposing or passing away. And so he uses this term to refer to politics and culture and society in the late 19th century, specifically this period after the Civil War. So when historians talk about the Gilded Age, they're typically talking about this time really from after 1877 to the turn of the century, right, to about 1900. And we're going to see that as we move forward, there is this relationship between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era that comes after it. And I really want us to think about how these are in tandem, because in a lot of ways, the problems or that wood part, that corruptibility that's a part of the Gilded Age that's up under what looks valuable is really going to set the pace for the Progressive Era that comes forward. I want you to understand how the Progressive Era is essentially set up by the problems of the Gilded Age. The Progressives, which we'll come back and see, are trying to remedy the issues in American society that become very apparent in the late 19th century. Now, we've seen this long, drawn-out battle between different visions of what America should be over the past, 100 years at this point. We saw the Jefferson vision versus the Hamilton vision, that Federalist versus Anti-Federalist. We have, big solid global economy, big federal bureau infrastructure, bureaucracy, banking, industry versus agricultural, state autonomy. And this kind of gets simplistically lumped in versus North versus South, right? Industry versus slavery. We can see that there is these, generalizations that have some real grounding in truth, but tell a partial story. Two things that really complicate this story is, as we've seen, slavery and westward expansion. As we've seen, the issue of slavery spreading into the West is what eventually tore the country apart. Another huge complication is the Industrial Revolution. Now, we saw in the early 19th century that the market revolution had begun to change the face of America. This was primarily located around things like transportation and communication, right? Telegraphs, canals, railroads, steamboats. We can see how the Industrial Revolution that began in the early 1800s really sets the pace. We get sidetracked kind of in the middle of the century by the Civil War, and then as we begin to move forward, particularly as radical Republicans begin to lose hold on the American South, and they begin to refocus on those foundational ideas of the Republican Party, right? Building a solid economy, strong infrastructure, controlling the West, really bringing the Union back together and subduing the continent. This political shift dovetails with an exponential explosion in industrial innovation as well. So it's often referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution from the 1870s to the turn of the century in the 1900s, really is a continuation, right? Just like we've seen that there's the First Great Awakening and a Second Great Awakening, but really these are not separated by much time or space. The same is true for the Industrial Revolution. These are just ways in which we kind of lump things together. We see the harnessing of steam and then eventually railroads in the 1840s and 1850s, and this is really going to culminate in some rapid transformations that begin to happen towards the end of the century. But it's kind of a century of technological evolution. It's just there is this rapid innovation that begins to happen that really makes that early Jeffersonian vision of a patchwork of autonomous states held together by a commitment to an agricultural vision of the nation. It's a vision or a dream of the nation that increasingly becomes impossible. Some of the major innovations: 1866, we see the transatlantic telegraph cable to Europe. 1876, Graham invents the telephone. 1890s, we have 500,000 telephones. By 1900, 1 million. 1920, like 13 million. It's insane, the exponential growth that explodes. And we're pretty accustomed to technological innovation happen in exponential fashion. If you think of the internet, social media, AI, all happening within a generation and a half, this is essentially what's happening in the late 1800s. Creation of the light bulb, the harnessing of electricity. Eventually we'll go from separated, dark, rural to this emerging, increasingly urban America. We also have innovations like the typewriter, the cash register, adding machines, revolutionizing business. Very substantial. We have refrigerated rail cars. This sounds very almost primitive or rudimentary to us, but this is a game changer. If you think about those connectivity, that market revolution that set the the Erie Canal, the interconnectivity of canals and railroads, that laid the initial groundwork. By the end of the century, it's not just wood or timber that you can get from Chicago to the eastern seaboard or to Europe. It's refrigerated cars that can carry meat. If you're raising cattle in Texas, you have markets on the East Coast in a way that had never been before. I want us to think about how at the end of the 19th century, the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and the evolution in politics go hand in hand to create a very specific climate. Railroads become the epicenter of this evolution. Think about the problems of the Gilded Age, specifically lack of government regulation, poor working conditions, the emergence of monopolies, things that people point to the failures of capitalism in the 19th century. These all revolve around railroads and the complications of government and private investment in those. Railroads exploded throughout the mid-1800s. They connected distant markets to raw materials. Roughly 30,000 miles of track in 1860, went to 190, almost 200,000 in 1900. And the federal government began subsidizing railroad expansion. What this did is this helped make the rise of the modern corporation possible. For incorporation, or the ideas that investors can come in and have limited liability, LLC. They're able to invest in an economic endeavor, and if that thing succeeds, then they get paid back with dividends and they make a profit. If it fails, then they lose their money but nothing else. The patchwork of laws that began being laid for the modern corporation began in the market revolution and then really began to culminate into something that looks very modern by the end of the 1800s. Most of the monopolies and the people that became exponentially wealthy during the late 1800s are often tied to the railroad industry. So if you'll notice, we have banking, we have steel, we have petroleum, all of these things. If you think of Rockefeller, Carnegie, Gould, all of these magnates that began to emerge are typically tied to the railroad industry in some fashion. This brings us to the idea of government oversight. So from the South's perspective, the Republicans in the late 1800s, or coming through the Civil War, are the party of big government. They want a large federal government that can tell the South what to do when it comes to economic things, social issues, civil rights, as we've seen, the rise and fall of Reconstruction. It is a large controlling federal government. From a modern perspective, the Republicans of the 1800s are conservative in many ways. Gilded Age is known for its lack of government intervention when it comes to economic policy. When the government does get involved, it's usually to subsidize private investment, specifically in the railroads, land grants. It would extend business, it would extend opportunity. When it came to regulating business, specifically monopolies, workers' rights, minimum wages, these things that we take for granted now, these were largely absent. And so historians will use this word, laissez-faire capitalism, to describe the Gilded Age. Fair capitalism, or what's typically referred to as hands-off capitalism, is the idea that markets thrive best when the government is involved least. This notion is typically associated with economic conservatism, but it also, you might see the word classical liberalism. Economic conservatism and classical liberalism, it can be confusing because those liberalism and conservatism seems at odds in the contemporary mind, but classical liberalism was the idea that the church or the state should not have its huge role in the independent lives of American citizens. From that perspective, markets do better when they rise and fall on their own and they regulate themselves when they get out of whack. And allowing that to happen maximizes autonomy for the most individuals. These are basic principles of classical liberalism or modern economic conservatism. This might seem well and good, and from the outside things might look pretty cool, but very quickly in the Gilded Age, the cracks in this philosophy become evident. One of the clearest examples of this is how during the Gilded Age, many of these emergent corporations very quickly become monopolies. Historians sometimes talk about the two ways in which a corporation will become a monopoly. There are two types of integration that they will point to. One is vertical integration, where essentially a monopoly will come in and buy up the chain of production from raw material to the market. If you're producing meat, they'll buy the cattle, the slaughterhouses, the refrigerated rail cars, the cooled warehouses, the meat packing plants, delivery wagons, all the way to the grocery stores. You have complete control from raw material to market. Another way is horizontal integration, where when something becomes big enough, it begins to buy up all the competition so that it's in that same place again. Monopolies in the late 1800s utilize both of these, so they will try to buy up something from raw material all the way to market and then buy up all the competition as well. Without anti-monopoly laws in place, very quickly this system, or laissez-faire capitalism, that's supposed to maximize liberty and allow someone who is poor to pull themselves up and work really hard eventually until they can become a Rockefeller or a Carnegie, it becomes very evident that that's only going to happen to a few people, and people get in those positions, they essentially make it impossible for the common worker to do the same. It begins to be a split of opinion. What is America American? What is the best way forward? Some will say preserving a more hands-off approach to the economy is the best, and others will say there needs to be some sort of government intervention in order to preserve competition as some become exponentially wealthy. In many ways, we're still having this conversation today, right? We look to a place like America where you can go and you can be a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk, hopefully, start something in your garage and eventually become a billionaire. Other people will say that once something becomes so big, there's the inability to compete with it. How do you become a warehouse worker at Amazon and then eventually work your way up to Jeff Bezos? Some will say that the landscape makes that possible. Others will say that it is impossible. And this is a conversation that goes back at least over 150 years. Those that will defend the more conservative approach to economics will look at figures like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and they will say these are captains of industry that should be emulated. Making sure that there remains minimal government regulation will keep a society in which people can eventually become Carnegies or Rockefellers. If we look at Andrew Carnegie, we have a Scottish immigrant turned steel magnate, born 1835, lived to 1919. He ends up coming in using these different types of integration, vertical and horizontal, to essentially buy up mines, ships, acquiring railroads, controlling the process of steel from mine to market, eventually selling this huge thing that he had created to J.P. Morgan for millions and millions of dollars, and Morgan ends up merging it, creating a billion-dollar enterprise that controlled 2/3 of the nation's steel production. Rockefeller, in the same vein, 1839 to 1937. 1870, he forms Standard Oil, uses vertical and horizontal integration to buy up chains of production and competition to create one of the most loved and one of the most hated empires in America. Bought up competition, barrel factories, warehouses, pipelines, freight cars. In 1880, he was the archetype of a monopoly, and he controlled access to almost 90% of the nation's oil. There was a lot in American culture that defended the inequality that emerged in the Gilded Age. In the realm of culture, there were the Horatio Alger novels. These were very popular stories typically about young men who started with nothing and pulled themselves up through hard work and ambition to become very successful or wealthy. And on a deeper philosophical level, there were defenders of laissez-faire capitalism, or the inequality that emerged in the Gilded Age. One significant term that we should give some attention to is this idea of social Darwinism. Now, if you're familiar with Darwin's theory of evolution that was first published in 1859 when he published The Origin of Species, Darwin had kind of laid out an idea of the biological landscape, and he essentially said that there is this never-ending battle over resources. His idea was that all life in this competition was either better suited to their environment to flourish or succeed, or those that were not better suited would eventually die off or not pass their genes on. Darwin's original idea was not that the strongest survive. It was that which is best adapted to its environment will be able to pass its genes on and therefore proliferate through the generations. But after Darwin published The Origin of Species and his idea of natural selection, other people began to take it in different ways. And sociologists, philosophers, and other thinkers began to look at it outside of the realm of biology. Social Darwinism is one of these evolutions of Darwin's idea. At its basis, social Darwinism says that some people are better suited to succeed and other people aren't. A phrase that often gets used in social Darwinism is survival of the fittest. Often interpreted as the strongest survive, this is essentially a defense of inequality in the social sphere. The basic idea here is that the people with the best capability, the most ingenuity, that are strongest, that are more hardworking, will eventually overcome adversity and become successful. The flip side of that is people who are interpreted to be lazy or uncommitted or perhaps not as intelligent or capable will eventually die out. See how this becomes problematic pretty quickly. As we move forward, I want us to think about social Darwinism and how that supports ideas of laissez-faire capitalism, or the idea that it's not the role of the state or the government to intervene when there is social inequality, and contrast that perhaps with the emerging progressive movement that begins to happen in reaction to the Gilded Age. This doesn't remain very abstract for very long. Very quickly, the Industrial Revolution begins to pull people into cities at an unprecedented rate. Rural people begin to flock to cities. There's little job security because there's not government regulation. There's no minimum wage. There's no working conditions. There's no government oversight in any way. Workers are paid about 70 or 80% of a living wage. They have long, dangerous hours. Many lived in poverty. Old traditions of skilled work began to give way to kind of this mindless mechanistic labor in factories. It's exacerbated by other social issues, namely a rapid influx of immigrants coming from vastly different places that had happened in previous decades. Early in mid-1800s, most immigration came from Western and Northern European countries. Think Germany, Ireland. Many of those, particularly the Irish, met discrimination, and native backlash, but eventually became incorporated into the American mainstream. By the late 1800s, there was a change in these demographics. We had Eastern and Southern European immigrants begin to come in large droves, so Polish, Russian, Italians. Often these were met with the same discrimination and nativist backlash that Irish had decades before. In the minds of many Americans, a lot of these immigrants were bringing in things that didn't seem so American. Many of them were not Protestant, they might be Catholic, some of them were opposed to American political systems and preferred things like anarchy or even socialism. When many of these immigrants landed in American cities and began to take difficult jobs, they eventually began to come together and unionize. So very quickly see how the emergence of things like organized labor or the call for government oversight can quickly be deemed undemocratic or un-American or socialist or anarchist, any number of things. Essentially, we begin to have a culture war that emerges that says immigrants are bringing in foreign ideas, and this is making American society less American. There's also the issue of women and children. So by 1900, 20% of manufacturing was done by women. Textiles remained the largest for women's production. This began during the market revolution and really exploded by the end of the century. You have almost 2 million children under 16 who were employed in factories working all the time. Minimum work hours and wages often weren't set. If they were by the state, and they were often ignored. Very quickly, the plight of the workers, immigration, urbanization, these things become very pressing issues. Failures of the Gilded Age were most clearly seen in American cities, where you have large groups of people clumped together, often immigrants coming from other places, working long hours, women, children. Not just the absence of minimum wage laws or safety hazards at work, it's also regulations on buildings where you have no fire escapes, no plumbing, no windows or heating. You have shared bathrooms and basements with multiple people living in small areas. Deaths often led to orphans. Poverty led to violence. It was very clear that something needed to be done. It wasn't just clear in cities, though. It was also in the rural countryside. Very quickly, the monopolies, big industry, agribusiness, the emergence of this began to push out small farmers to the point where there were farmers' alliances that began to come together. And essentially what they were asking for was government oversight when it came to the production of agriculture. By 1875, there were farmers' alliances that were establishing stores. They wanted banks. They wanted to offset the power that big business and monopolies had. They sent out lectures against big business, and they even established a third political party, the Populist Party. Most famously, the Populist Party put forth its Omaha platform in 1892. And essentially what this was is a rejection of laissez-faire capitalism. And I want us to think about this. This is rural agricultural Americans asking for federal oversight in order to preserve their ability to live and to thrive. They wanted a national network of warehouses that was regulated by the federal government so they couldn't be priced out by big business. They wanted the ability to borrow money at fair interest rates. They wanted the direct election of American senators. They wanted federal regulation of things like railroads, telephones, and telegraphs, essentially the nationalization of utilities. Back in the cities, the emergence of organized labor, specifically the emergence of unions, began to split the American public. The Knights of Labor, which had been established in the 1860s, had paved the way for organized labor. They were open to anybody who worked, even women. The only people that they really excluded were lawyers, bankers, alcohol dealers, and gamblers. So you can kind of see their culture that they were trying to put forth there. They were loosely organized, they kind of lacked direction, and eventually they began to fall apart by the 1900s. In its place, we see the emergence of the American Federation of Labor, which was established in 1886. What this did was bring skilled laborers together in order to fight the oppressive work environments, poor working conditions, low pay. They argued for an 8-hour workday, and they began to do things like strike in order to try to push back against big business and secure the things that they wanted in order to live happy lives. One of the most famous strikes that happened in the Gilded Age was the Haymarket Affair in May of 1886. This is a general strike in Chicago that ended up spilling out into the Haymarket Square. Eventually, when the laborers began to clash with police, someone threw a bomb, no one knows who, and when it exploded, it killed 7 policemen and 4 civilians. Although no one actually knew who threw the bomb, they had some that were singled out and essentially scapegoated for it. We had 8 anarchist activists that began to get rounded up and given an unjust trial. One of them killed themselves, 4 of them were executed, and 2 of them eventually had their sentences commuted when it was seen that the trial was unjust. But this really gives us an insight into this culture war that begins to happen. Haymarket Affair gives us insight into the boiling point that America was beginning to come through. Big business versus labor, the urbanization of America, immigration, all of these things were coming together to create a very tense atmosphere. Quickly, Americans began to point fingers, and it was typically immigrants seen as pulling in radical ideologies from other countries that got the finger pointed at them. After the Haymarket Affair, there was the Homestead Strike. Here we have iron and steel workers associated with the AFL striking in Pittsburgh. This is against Carnegie and his steel company. It cut wages. Eventually they brought in private strike busters that tried to break things up, and if things became violent. Brings us to another point, is during this Gilded Age, during this idea of hands-off laissez-faire capitalism that gets associated with the Gilded Age, or less regulation, typically when things came to a head between big business and workers, the federal government, when they came in, would side with big business in the Gilded Age. The Homestead Strike is a really good example of this. When eventually the National Guard comes in, it suppresses this strike, and eventually they surrender and the workers lost their power. Third significant strike that happened was the Pullman Strike in 1894. Here you have the Pullman Palace Car Company that manufactured rail cars. They're kind of like a luxury company. The Pullman Strike really shows the insidiousness of how far monopolization can go when unchecked. Pullman had created a company town. What company towns are is they're where a large business owner or someone who's monopolizing an industry can come in and have a factory or something where people work, and eventually they will buy up everything around this. So if you are part of a company town, you might go and work for your employer, and then that employer also owns the house you live in, perhaps even has the pastor at the church inside this town on the payroll, or the store where you buy things. Everything is a closed system where you can control labor all the way from working to rent to the things that people buy, where all of this money is coming back into the person and benefiting the person that owns the monopoly. Pullman had created one of these company towns, and he called the people that worked there his children. In 1893, he cut wages by 25%, citing economic depression, but he wouldn't cut the rents. Eventually, there was this strike that happened, and if you think about the power of this, this has literally shut down Chicago. At this point, Chicago was the gateway to the West. It ends up controlling the passageway to the West Coast. And very quickly, President Grover Cleveland ends up sending thousands of troops in to shut this strike down. In this showcases that during the Gilded Age, when there was this combat between big business and labor, the federal government would come down on the side of big business. Organized labor in the Gilded Age had its work cut out for it. The AFL was only really for skilled labor. A lot of labor unions excluded black people, immigrants, women. Any time that there was battles, as we've seen, that the federal government would come in on the side of big business as opposed to labor. And this is this struggle that begins to happen, the violence that's ensuing, these emerging ideas of urbanization, immigration, industrialization really becoming a boiling point will eventually push us to the need for change. So next, when we talk about the progressives, we'll see how certain Americans begin to try to deal with these issues.